So thank you, everyone, and welcome to our March Colloquium, the Anthropocene, a challenge for sciences, humanities, and the public. Today, we have Dr. Fabienne Will, and she'll speak about the Anthropocene as a provocation to, and simultaneously a chance for inter- and transdisciplinary cooperation. Her presentation will show that with the Anthropocene debate, boundaries between nature and culture, subject and object, or environment and society get blurred, as do long-established disciplinary cultures of knowledge production. Dr. Will studied history, German philology, and Italian philology at LMU. She holds a Ph.D. in science history from the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental and Society, also at LMU. And since last year, she has been a science communication coordinator at the intersection between the MSCL and the Deutsches Museum. Until 2022, she was a scholar resident at the Research Institute for History of Science and Technology at the Deutsches Museum, working on the Anthropocene and the history of environmental perception. So join me and welcome Dr. Fabienne Will today, and we're excited for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction, Paulina. I just share my screen. You see it? Okay, perfect. So as you may know, or most of you may know, the Anthropocene has triggered a very broad debate over the last 20 years and has developed into a complex and multidimensional issue. And I could speak to you for several hours about this fascinating topic, but since today I have only a limited amount of time, in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to try to give you an idea of what I did in my research, a broad overview of the debate, and I will talk about the challenges that come into play with this concept within academia, as well as at the interstice of academia and the public sphere. For this, we will proceed as follows. First of all, I will give you a short introduction into the topic. Then I will tell you why the Anthropocene can be perceived as a provocation to sciences and humanities. After that, we will take a brief look at one example, the debate about the Anthropocene as a geological concept. And in the next step, I will speak a little about the challenge of communicating the Anthropocene. What is the Anthropocene? I'll give you just a short outline on the origins of the debate, which is important to know if we want to properly discuss any implications of the concept. Back in 2000, there was a conference of the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program, and at this conference, the term Holocene has come up several times. And at a certain point, Paul Crutzen, atmospheric chemist who was there as well, stood up and said that we had long been in the Anthropocene. And in this same year, he published his original thesis together with Eugene Stürmer in the IGBP newsletter that humans are altering the Earth systems in a way that justifies the declaration of a new geological epoch named after humans. And this epoch began with the Industrial Revolution, more precisely with the invention of the steam engine by James Watt in 1784. So their thesis back then. And as we can see here, since the term was coined in 2000, a multi-layered and very dynamic debate has been formed around the Anthropocene. Analytically, we can distinguish between a debate about the Anthropocene as a geological concept, as a cultural concept, and as a societal phenomenon. In practice, these three strands of the debate are, of course, closely interwoven, but in order to be able to undertake a meta-scientific analysis, this differentiated approach at the analytical and conceptual level has proved to be very useful. And the starting point of my research was that in the debate about the Anthropocene, numerous epistemological interests, lines of argumentation, and interpretation converge, leading to negotiation processes around legitimate knowledge in novel constellation. That's why I asked the question of how specific disciplinary evidence practices and also specific conceptions of time change when different expert groups are involved in an evidence production process that is traditionally reserved for a particular discipline. I defined evidence practices according to the definition in the research group I have been part of during my PhD time as processes and mechanisms of producing and applying evidence in the process of scientific knowledge production within and across disciplines. And evidence itself we defined, according to Richard Rorty, as socially consented, validated knowledge that emerges in negotiation processes and is attempted to be stabilized through context-specific practices. And the debate about the Anthropocene is particularly well suited for examining discipline-specific evidence practices because it is a thesis that originated in Earth system science that has then evolved into a concept with multiple meanings and is negotiated in different disciplines with different emphasis. In this process, the individual disciplines reach their limits with their established methodologies, which forces the actors involved to leave their comfort zones and enter an active negotiation process with representatives of other disciplines on the production and also the importance of different evidence. Thereby, established disciplinary evidence practices are challenged and new collaborations beyond disciplinary boundaries are initiated. And this makes it a very exciting object of investigation in terms of questions about evidence generation and potential changes of established disciplinary evidence practices. But at the same time, it means that the Anthropocene concept holds a strong potential also for provocation. And I could see that it is as much a provocation for geology as it is for the humanities and social sciences. The geological provocation of the Anthropocene consists of, first, the geological brevity of the negotiated time unit. Because the Anthropocene, with its currently consented birth date in the 1950s, is in geological terms quasi non-existent. Just for you to know, the duration of geological epochs is defined in the International Stratigraphic Guide with 13 to 35 million years. And the Anthropocene, with its only 70 years, does not fit this criteria. A second provocation is that the Anthropocene is kind of material unavailable, because geological time units are determined by the deposits in the strata that can be assigned to the time unit in question, the so-called series. And in its thinness, the Anthropocene series differs fundamentally from the nature of the series on which previously ratified time units are based. A third point is the novelty of existing materials in the strata, because geologists get aware of that their expertise is no longer sufficient for new materials like plastics. Another point is the future dimension that comes into play with the Anthropocene, because geologists are suddenly confronted with the challenge to include probabilistic analysis in their considerations. And regarding that, Jan Salasiewicz, a geologist, a very important geologist involved in the debate, told me that in an interview in stratigraphy, in the formal part of the work, we have to say the future stops here, and all the evidence we consider stops here. So although the intended formalization of this new epoch will be based on traceable evidence in already deposited strata, the future plays a direct role in the decision-making process, for example, in considerations about how long certain markers will be traceable, like new materials like plastics again. Also, the term Anthropocene itself provokes geologists because it puts acting actor in its center, and also that is something that does not at all correspond to the criteria of stratigraphy. And the last point is the big media interest and the normative charge of the concept. Here, it's important to know that geologists explicitly perceive themselves as not being normative, and suddenly they talk about responsibility, which is completely new to them. So it is therefore not surprising that traditional evidence production processes, as well as the use of specific evidence practices, are questioned. Similar to the geological provocation, the Anthropocene concept is also a provocation for the humanities and social sciences. This one, however, has different characteristics. Here, one very important point is that the effect-centeredness of stratigraphy seems to be diametrically opposed to the cause and process orientation of humanities disciplines. Also, the term itself provokes. Here it's much about the question, who is the anthropos in the Anthropocene? Here the lack of differentiation is criticized a lot, because whereas in geology it's unproblematic to use the species concept, not least because in the case of the Anthropocene, no differentiated attribution of responsibility is intended from a geological perspective, but it is exclusively about the effects which can be seen in strata. For disciplines of the humanities and social sciences, that's a big bothering, and discussions about this issue have been the subject of intense debate for years. And here we come back to this figure, because starting from the criticism of the lack of differentiation, it has become kind of common practice to underpin the perspective one has taken with an alternative term. And the more than 100 proposed terms you can see here illustrate that the Anthropocene has developed into a concept with multiple meanings. However, the different perspectives reflected in those terms do not necessarily oppose each other, but they rather complement each other in terms of content. And the number of alternatives offered, some of which should be certainly taken more seriously than others, indicates at the same time that the phenomena described by the Anthropocene are accepted as given and are not questioned anymore. And historian Libby Robin puts that as follows: the genie's out of the bottle, everybody's using it. Another point of provocation is that the geological negotiation of the Anthropocene is perceived as an encroachment on previous definitional sovereignties of humanities and social science disciplines. Here, the most obvious example is that it is about the periodization of human history. And this kind of periodizing time was traditionally the domain of history. And one of the central actors, again, Jan Selasiewicz, summarized this conflicting situation when he told me about an encounter with a historian on a conference who accused me and another geologist of stealing time. A fourth point of provocation is the Eurocentric content of the concept. Here, the lack of differentiation in geographical terms is criticized, and it has become a trend in recent years to place the Anthropocene, most of all among historians, but I will come back to that later. And another point of provocation is the need for integrating the planetary perspective. And that shows the limits of established categories, concepts, narratives, and challenges humanities, because it becomes apparent that we need new narratives based on new temporalities to make sense of the Anthropocene. This is in German, I'm sorry for that, but yeah, due to time constraints, I will not explain this figure in detail now, but what I would like to show is that the central processes and also practices that are really used for generating evidence in the debate and that structure the whole debate are the practices of inclusion and exclusion. And as you can see here, inclusion and exclusion do not follow each other linearly, but are part of circular mechanisms and often trigger dynamic processes in the field of evidence production. This is here indicated with de- and restabilizing effects. And I will show you what I mean and with that by going a little deeper into the debate about the Anthropocene as a geological concept. The debate about the Anthropocene as a geological concept takes place mainly within the Anthropocene working group and also in negotiation between the broader geological community and the AWG. The AWG has been established in 2009 following the advice of the SQS, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, and has since been charged with examining the Anthropocene for its geological existence and compiling sufficient stratigraphic evidence and analysis to launch a formal ratification proposal. So since 2009, the AWG has been the central player in the geological debate. The usual procedure when it comes to formalize a new geological time unit is that it exists for every time unit you can see here on the chronostratigraphic chart exists a working group. So that we don't have only an Anthropocene working group, but there's also a Holocene working group, a Pleistocene working group, etc. And as soon as this working group gathered enough evidence, they can make a formal ratification proposal. And they have, as we can see here, the Anthropocene working group, that's the level we are in now. They make this proposal, and then if there's a voting process and if a majority of more than 60% votes for a yes, so to integrate the new epoch, the new time unit to the chronostratigraphic chart, then it goes to the next level, which is here, the subcommission on quaternary stratigraphy. After that, it goes to the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and then it goes to the International Union of Geological Sciences as the last instance. And just to give you an idea what we're talking about, the Anthropocene is planned to end the Holocene and to be ratified as a new geological epoch after the Holocene. So, but what makes the Anthropocene working group unique, and how do inclusion and exclusion come into play in this regard? The establishment of the AWG can be seen as an institutionalization of evidence generation and validation. And it represents in a twofold perspective in terms of content and personal, both an inclusive and an exclusionary moment. Because with the official establishment of a stratigraphic gremium dealing exclusively with the Anthropocene, the thesis of the Anthropocene is implicitly affirmed for the time being. And this results really in a wave of criticism and counter-arguments from critics from within geology in 2009 and the following years. And in terms of personal, this institutionalization leads to the integration of disciplines from outside the field into the geological decision-making process, because Jan Salasiewicz, the former chair of the Anthropocene Working Group, has opted for an interdisciplinary composition of the group. So, for example, with John McNeil and Naomi Oreskes, we have two historians in the group. We have, with Davor Vidas, one person from law in the group. There are philosophers, biologists, etc. And even a journalist was part of the group until 2016. And this is an absolute novelty in geology. This has never happened before. Yeah, and many geologists, but also humanities scholars and social scientists perceive that as an exclusion because, as mentioned before, for some, no less than the definitional power over, for example, history is at stake. And furthermore, some geologists, like, for example, Stanley Finney, who is the acting chairman of the International Union of Geosciences, so the fourth instance, fear a politicization of their discipline through the interdisciplinarity and the engagement with normative issues. And interestingly, so Stanley Finney criticized the Anthropocene Working Group for more than 10 years for being an interdisciplinary group. And interestingly, most recently, Stanley Finney uses this interdisciplinary connectivity itself as an argument for his plea to treat the Anthropocene as a geological event, but not as an epoch. So now we learned a little about the structure and the composition of the Anthropocene Working Group, but what about their focus in terms of content? They focus mainly on three sub-discourses. It's about periodization, it's about markers, and it is about technology. Regarding the periodization, there have been multiple phases of opening and closing, of inclusion and exclusion. In the first, which was a pre-institutional phase of the debate between 2000 and 2009, ideas about what the Anthropocene could mean have been gathered, and there have been first periodization proposals. In the second phase, which begins with the establishment of the AWG in 2009, the debate about geological periodization takes place largely within or in negotiation with the working group and is characterized by openness to non-stratigraphic approaches. And this was a phase of consensus building and the tension between process and effect orientation. It was a really open evidence production process where dissenting proposals were welcome and triggered dynamic debates. So although the opening moment triggered by dissent presents itself as destabilizing under changed evidence generation science at first glance, it ultimately unfolds a restabilizing effect on the working process of the AWG. And in this process, interdisciplinary connectivity is repeatedly used as an argument and thus also as an evidence practice, as the following quote from a paper exemplifies. However, a boundary placed at the time instant of the Alamogordo test would mark a historic turning point of global significance associated with the Great Acceleration, while in practical stratigraphic terms, it would include all primary stratigraphic signals of bomb-related radionuclides, including those of the geologically simultaneous Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945 bombs. So what we can see is that the AWG uses the intended historical relevance specifically to support, or rather, to get the recognition through of the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch. And Salasiewicz and others know how to use this destabilizing moment of interdisciplinarity for the narrow stratigraphic circle in the sense of a restabilizing effect on the broader geological community. From 2016 onwards, the third phase of the periodization discourse follows, which lasts until today and can be evaluated as a closure phase. And the 35th International Geological Congress in Cape Town acts as a key moment there and is reinforced by other events. For example, in 2018, the three sub-epochs you can see here of the Holocene, the Greenlandian, the North Scrippian, and the Megalayan, are ratified. And this kicked off a discussion on what that means for the ratification of the Anthropocene, because the IUGS, the fourth instance, made a kind of mistake. They posted on Twitter that the Megalayan lasts until 1950. And then people asked themselves, okay, does that mean that the Anthropocene is already kind of ratified unofficially, and because the Megalayan lasts until 1950 and not until today? And a few days later, the IUGS posted again something on Twitter correcting themselves that the Megalayan lasts until today. And with this tweet, we can see here of a geologist, Ben van der Pluim, what the fuck is the Megalayan? It can be seen a little like emblematic for the geological resistance towards the transformation of established evidence practices, because his main complaint is that the recognition of these three relatively short sub-epochs of the Holocene, in geological terms short, heralded a formal change in the established practice of geological time division. And he asks, what comes next? Do we have a Linonian, a Mendelian? Another thing that reinforces this closure phase is the presentation of the logo of the AWG that you can see here. It has been presented in 2018, and the graph we can see refers also to a beginning of the Anthropocene in the 1950s with this hockey stick curve. And yeah, from 2016 onwards, more focus is placed on technical stratigraphic issues to initiate really this ratification proposal. So it is about to find a golden spike, a GSSP cores are analyzed, and interestingly, this analysis is funded by the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. So we have like a very intense cooperation between a humanities institution and the geology here. And for May, a press conference is expected, but the consensus for now is that the Anthropocene has begun in the 1950s. The central reason here is that the marker, the primary marker plutonium-239, is traceable isochronously for this time. Yeah, and it is supported by many secondary markers. And it's worth to have a short look at the markers, at the secondary markers, discussed also when it comes to the question of how to communicate the Anthropocene. We have as secondary markers, for example, technofossils. According to estimates, the mass of the technosphere, understood as the totality of the material output of all human endeavors, amounts to about 30 trillion tons. This corresponds to about 50 kilos per square meter of Earth. And moreover, the technofossil diversity already surpasses the biodiversity in richness. And this discourse around technofossils and the so-called technosphere also demonstrated destabilization of established historiographic concepts and methods of investigation, because the AWD is challenged to develop new definitions for new geological deposits and strata, and to consult with technostratigraphy on the establishment of a new subdiscipline. And this destabilizing moment in the end has at the same time a restabilizing effect with regard to the superordinate question about the geoscientific existence of the new epoch of the age of humans. Another secondary marker that is discussed is bones of broiler chickens as a biofossil. Those bones are traceable in the strata worldwide and differ fundamentally from the bones of their ancestors. They are way bigger, as you can see here, and they also show an elevated radioisotope and nitrate content. And another interesting secondary marker is plastics. I mean, every one of us knows that we use plastics a lot. And why do I tell you about that with regard to communication? Because I think that technofossils, broiler chickens, and plastics can be seen as what historian Gabriel Hecht describes as interscalar objects. Those objects are closely connected to the everyday life of people and are a possible starting point to communicate this very abstract and large-scale concept of the Anthropocene. I will not elaborate on changing practices, evidence practices, and the content of the debate about the Anthropocene as a cultural concept now due to time constraints, but I would like to rather sketch the question of how actors that are part of the debate on the Anthropocene as a cultural concept or as a societal phenomenon use the large-scale geological findings in communication to broader audiences. And here, for example, close cooperations between the AWG as a group or single members of the groups and practitioners and scholars from other disciplines or outside academia are out there. For example, as I already mentioned, a very close cooperation with the Haus der Kultur in der Welt in Berlin that started in 2013 with the Anthropocene project, and they had a first Anthropocene campus in 2014, and this project, this cooperation is still running. Then they work together with journalists, the group, or also with artists. They were part of movies. For example, a journalist from the BBC made the first documentary on the Anthropocene and interviewed members of the Anthropocene working group in this movie. Then we have cooperations with artists, between single members and artists, etc. Then there's a trend, as I said, among historians to place the Anthropocene, to tell local stories of this planetary concept. There are lots of papers about, for example, an Asian Anthropocene. We have a Brazilian Anthropocene, we have an African Anthropocene, a British Anthropocene. And there are many different things going on. And also the walking the Anthropocene has for some years, or some scholars I met did those projects on walking the Anthropocene to give people the chance, lay people, kind of non-scientific audience, the chance to tell their own stories of the Anthropocene. And regarding the placing, I brought one more quote from an environmental historian from Brazil, José Augusto Padua. And he said that the idea is to locate the Anthropocene on a geographical framework, to situate the Anthropocene. But when I argue in favor of studying national cases, even micro-regional cases or macro-regional cases, it's not to go back to national histories. The idea is to reframe national history and local history in the context of the global Anthropocene phenomena. I'm arguing in favor of complexity. We need to understand that at the same time, we have a high-level aggregation reality, and we have to locate and to differentiate what exists inside it. This is one aspect that can be a contribution by historians and social scientists. Another possibility to communicate the Anthropocene is to use Anthropocene objects to do so. There again, the markers come into play. Markers such as technofossils can help to localize the planetary and bridge the gap between past and future temporal as well as spatial scales. And there has been, for example, a cooperation between the AWG and an artist, Yesenia Thibault-Picasso, who did a project on technofossils together. And then for sure, like formats such as exhibitions are a way to communicate the Anthropocene. We had the first big exhibition on the topic here in the Deutsches Museum from 2014 to 2016. And there are many other exhibitions out there in the meantime, for example, also in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh even had the first curator of the Anthropocene in 2018 with Nicole Heller. We have theater pieces on this topic. During the last year in the Staatstheater in Nuremberg, there was a piece on the Anthropocene. And the other picture you can see here is from an opera in Great Britain on the Anthropocene. We have like comics on it and very many different formats that try to communicate this topic and to make it more experienceable with the emotional connection. To conclude, at first glance, the Anthropocene debate may appear to be a confusing mixture of opposing positions, but on closer inspection, it becomes apparent that the debate is composed of various sub-discourses which, from a meta perspective, do not oppose but complement each other. The provocative potential of the concept is nevertheless present and consists primarily in blurring established boundaries in terms of content, discipline, and categorization in an unprecedented way. The individual disciplines reach their limits with the established knowledge production processes in the Anthropocene debate, and as a result, established disciplinary evidence practices come under pressure for legitimacy and are renegotiated in inter, and also transdisciplinary arenas. This has a dynamizing effect and puts circular mechanisms in motion. What acts as inclusion and restabilizing in one context can act as exclusion and destabilizing in another context. The central point of friction in the whole debate and the starting point also really of many discussions turned out to be the effect-centeredness of stratigraphy, which is opposed to the cause and process orientation of many other disciplines. But this can be addressed as dialogue is desired, as another quote from Jan Selasiewicz illustrates. He said, "I'm very glad that humanities are taking the interest they're doing, because if you are to understand the Anthropocene, you have to understand the driver. We are rock people, we are not very good with humans." So I think that the concept has the potential to develop new narratives based on new temporalities. And also until today, the Anthropocene has become a field of remarkable collaborations across the broad academic spectrum and beyond. And I think that much has already been gained by this, because I don't know if we need anything more urgently than the dialogue that transcends traditional boundaries about man's responsibility for the earth, and not only in the past and the present, but also in the future. So maybe lessons can be learned from the Anthropocene debate also regarding like communication formats for the concept of planetary health. Maybe both concepts could mutually benefit each other. And I will start with another quote from Tim finish with another quote from Tim Lecain, who said, "The beauty of the Anthropocene is the bringing together of sciences and humanities." Thank you very much.